We are taught that the brain creates consciousness. Every thought, every memory, every moment of awareness is assumed to arise from the activity of billions of neurons. They then communicate through electrical and chemical signals. When those signals change, experience changes. When the brain is injured, consciousness fades or fragments. When the brain shuts down completely, awareness disappears. At least that is the model most of us grew up with. It feels intuitive. Damage the machine and the output fails. Turn the system off and the experience stops. But there is another possibility quietly circulating through science and philosophy, a much more curious idea that refuses to disappear. What if the brain is not producing consciousness at all? What if the brain is doing something closer to the opposite? In this view, consciousness does not originate inside the head. Instead, the brain acts as a kind of biological interface that limits, organizes, and transmits awareness into the specific form we recognize as human experience. This idea is often called the transmission theory. And once you start to examine the cases that support it and what it actually proposes, its implications become surprisingly difficult to dismiss. The idea that the brain might filter consciousness instead of creating it did not begin in modern debates about the mind. It appeared much earlier, at the birth of psychology itself. In the late 19th century, when scientists were first trying to understand the relationship between the brain and experience, one of the founders of modern psychology proposed something unusual. His name was William James. James believed the brain was deeply involved in consciousness. Changes to the brain reliably altered experience. Injury could disrupt perception, memory, or awareness, and direct stimulation could shift what a person saw or felt. Additionally, though, his own investigations led him to question what that relationship actually was. He did not just study ordinary consciousness, he explored unusual states directly, including mystical experiences and chemically altered states, such as those induced by nitrous oxide, which he experimented with himself. In these states, he reported a striking shift in perception. Awareness did not feel diminished or disorganized. It often felt intensified, accompanied by a sense of insight, as if underlying patterns of reality have briefly come into view. From this, James arrived at a more radical idea. What we call normal waking consciousness may not be the full range of the mind, but only one particular mode of it. Other forms of awareness, he suggested, exist alongside it, separated not by distance, but by what he described as the filmiest of screens. If the brain truly produces consciousness the way a generator produces electricity, then consciousness should always shrink when brain activity is reduced or disrupted. Instead of assuming the brain manufactures mind, James suggested the brain might function more like a channel or transmission device. In his words, consciousness might be transmissive rather than projective. The brain would be not the source of the signal, it would be the structure that allows the signal to appear in a particular form. Around the same time, the French philosopher Henri Bergson was thinking about the brain in a surprisingly similar way. Bergson argued that the nervous system may exist primarily to limit consciousness, not expand it. Without some kind of filter, he suggested, the flood of sensory information and memory available to the mind would be overwhelming. The brain's job would be to restrict awareness to what is useful for action in the physical world. To Bergson, perception was not a window revealing reality in full detail. Instead, it was a narrowing, a selection, a survival interface between a much larger field of possible experience and the practical demands of a living body. Decades later, the same idea would reappear in a more modern form through the writer Aldous Huxley. Huxley was best known as the author of Brave New World, but he was also deeply interested in philosophy, perception, and the relationship between mind and reality. In 1954, he published a short but influential book called The Doors of Perception, reflecting on the nature of consciousness. In that book, he proposed something striking. The function of the brain and nervous system, he wrote, is in the main eliminative and not productive. Huxley suggested that the brain may act as a kind of biological regulator, limiting a much broader range of awareness into the thin stream of consciousness we normally experience. He called it a reducing valve. Without that valve, he argued, the human mind might be flooded with more information, sensation, and memory than a biological organism could handle. The brain in this picture does not open the gates of perception. In fact, it keeps most of them closed. These thinkers were proposing a different interpretation of the relationship between the brain and consciousness. And what makes this idea fascinating is that even modern neuroscience agrees with one crucial fact: the brain is constantly filtering reality. Every second, the nervous system is flooded with sensory information from the eyes, ears, skin, internal organs, and the surrounding environment. The amount of raw data entering the nervous system is enormous, yet the portion that reaches conscious awareness is extremely small. Some estimates suggest that while millions of bits of sensory information enter the nervous system each second, only a tiny fraction, perhaps on the order of a few dozen bits, ever becomes part of conscious experience. So most of what the brain receives is discarded, and our experience is narrowed and crafted. The visual system alone illustrates this. Your eyes are constantly moving in small jumps called saccades. Between these movements, the brain fills in gaps, stabilizes the image, and removes information that would otherwise make the world appear unstable. What we experience as a continuous visual scene is already a heavily edited construction. Attention narrows things even further. In experiments on an intentional blindness, people can fail to notice surprisingly large objects appearing directly in front of them. In one famous experiment, participants were asked to count basketball passes. In doing so, they sometimes failed to see a person in a gorilla suit walk through the scene. The information reached the eyes, but it never became part of conscious experience. The brain had already decided it was irrelevant. Modern theories of perception go even further. Many neuroscientists now describe perception as a predictive process. The brain is not simply recording the world as it arrives through the senses. Instead, it is constantly generating internal models of reality and comparing incoming signals to those predictions. In this view, perception is partially constructed from the inside out. The brain predicts what it expects to see and hear, and incoming sensory signals are used mainly to correct those predictions if they are wrong. So, even in mainstream neuroscience, the world we experience is already the result of extensive filtering, selection, and interpretation. But this is where things become interesting because some observations point toward a different reality. In certain psychedelic states, brain imaging studies have shown decreases in organized activity within large scale networks, such as the default mode network. Yet the subjective reports often describe perception becoming more vivid, detailed, or expansive. Additionally, in some forms of deep meditation, brain imaging studies have shown reductions in certain patterns of cortical activity. Under a simple generator model, we would expect awareness to fade as activity decreases. Yet, experienced meditators can report the opposite. Rather than dimming, perception can feel cleaner and more expansive, as if some of the brain's usual filtering or mental noise had softened while awareness itself remains vivid. In a very different context, rare medical reports known as terminal lucidity show a similar puzzle. In these cases, individuals with severe dementia who had lost the ability to recognize loved ones or speak coherently sometimes regain clear awareness shortly before death. For a brief period, they may recall memories, recognize family members, and engage in meaningful conversations. These episodes are still poorly understood, but they do raise some questions. If conscious clarity can briefly return when the brain is severely damaged or deteriorating, the relationship between the brain condition and conscious experience does not always seem to follow a linear pattern. Taken together, these observations hint that the relationship between the brain's activity and the richness of experience may not always be as simple or direct as we might expect. Even intention itself reveals how aggressively perception is narrowed. At any moment, the brain suppresses countless sounds, sensations, and visual details so that only a small number of signals dominate awareness. Without this constant suppression, the world would likely become overwhelming. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes perfect sense. Survival does not require an organism to perceive reality in its full complexity. It requires the organism to perceive only what is useful: edges instead of molecules, objects instead of atoms, threats, opportunities, movements, and faces. These are the important things. The brain compresses the world into something manageable, which means the world we experience every day is an extremely reduced version of what is physically present. And once that becomes obvious, another question naturally follows. If the brain shapes conscious experience, how much of the brain is actually required to produce it? In modern neuroscience, consciousness is generally understood as something that emerges from coordinated activity across the whole brain. Perception, memory, emotion, and the sense of self arise from the patterns of communication between many different neural systems, each contributing to its own specialized role. When these networks are active and working together, conscious experience appears. When they break down or damaged, consciousness fades or disappears. And in most situations, this relationship holds remarkably well. Severe brain injury can eliminate awareness. Anesthesia can temporarily shut it down. Damage to specific regions can erase memory, language, or perception. So the brain clearly matters, and I'm not suggesting otherwise. But if we are being honest, there are a few neurological cases, a few observations that make this a little less straightforward. One example comes from a rare surgical procedure called a hemispherectomy. In this operation, one entire cerebral hemisphere is removed or disconnected in order to stop severe epilepsy. The procedure is usually performed in children whose seizures cannot be controlled by any other means. Literally half the cortex is gone in some cases, yet many of these patients remain fully conscious. They develop language, attend school, form relationships, and build lives. They often experience weakness on one side of their body, but the mind itself stays present. A second observation comes from rare cases of long standing hydrocephalus. In this condition, fluid gradually builds up inside the brain's ventricles and slowly compresses the surrounding tissue. Over many years, the cortex can get pushed outward into a thin layer along the inside of the skull. In one widely discussed medical report, a 44-year-old Frenchman sought treatment for mild leg weakness. Brain scans revealed that most of the space inside his skull was filled with fluid, leaving only a thin rim of brain tissue around the edges. Yet he was conscious, married with two children, and working as a civil servant. The brain tissue was not absent, but it had been severely compressed, reducing its volume. Across these very different situations, a pattern begins to appear. Half the brain removed, consciousness persists. Brain tissue compressed, awareness remains. None of these observations overturn neuroscience. That is not the point. But they suggest that the relationship between the brain structure, brain activity, and lived experience is not as linear as our accepted models predict. By now, we have seen two important things. First, the brain clearly shapes and filters our experience of reality. Modern neuroscience shows that perception is heavily edited, compressed, and stabilized by neural processes. Second, the relationship between the physical state of the brain and the richness of conscious experience is not always as simple as the generator model might suggest. Those observations led some thinkers to propose another possibility. The central idea behind the transmission theory is surprisingly simple. Instead of the brain producing consciousness, it functions more like a biological system that shapes and organizes it. In this view, consciousness does not originate inside the brain. Rather, the brain receives, filters, and stabilizes a broader field of awareness into the particular form we experience as an individual mind. If this is true, the implications are vast. Under this framework, the brain would still be essential, but it would not be the ultimate source of awareness. It would be the structure that shapes how awareness appears. And once that idea is introduced, a series of questions naturally follow, at least for me. Like if consciousness is not created in the brain, where does it come from? How does the brain access it? And what happens when the brain stops functioning entirely? Transmission theory does not give a single definitive answer to those questions, but most interpretations begin from a similar starting point that consciousness may be fundamental rather than something produced by matter. One way of imagining this is to think of consciousness as something like a universal field. In physics, fields are not objects located in one place. They are structures that exist throughout space and can appear locally under the right conditions. Some interpretations of transmission theory suggest that consciousness could exist in a similar way. The brain would then function as a biological system that receives and organizes a local expression of the broader field into the experience of an individual mind. There is also a more minimal possibility. Consciousness may simply be a basic property of existence itself, not located anywhere in particular, not generated by matter, but present as an intrinsic feature of reality. Brains would then organize that intrinsic awareness into the structured experience we recognize as perception, thought, and identity. Although these interpretations differ, they share the same central insight. The brain does not generate consciousness, but it does perform a very specific role. It restricts awareness to a narrow and manageable bandwidth. It would organize perception into objects moving through space and time. It would generate the sense of self and stabilize memory so that experience unfolds as a continuous life rather than a chaotic stream of sensations. It would also suppress an enormous amount of information. Suddenly, psychedelic experiences, mystical states, deep meditation, and near death experiences could be moments where the brain's usual filtering patterns shift temporarily, adjusting access to its source. Some of the neurological puzzles we discussed earlier begin to look slightly different when we view it from this angle as well. Cases where large portions of the brain are removed, yet awareness persists, or rare episodes of lucidity appearing in severe neurological disease, these may reflect how flexible that filtering system can be. For me, though, the most interesting aspect appears when we ask what happens if the brain stops functioning entirely. Under the conventional model, the answer is clear. When the brain stops working, consciousness ends. But if the brain is not the ultimate source of consciousness, the picture becomes less certain. Some interpretations suggest that individual awareness may not disappear, but dissolve back into that larger field of consciousness. That awareness could persist without the biological filter that normally organizes it into a human mind. In that view, what falls away is not necessarily awareness itself, but the structure that shapes it into a self, while the underlying awareness remains an intrinsic part of reality. At present, there is no scientific evidence confirming any of these possibilities I just went over. I mean, how could you even set up an experiment to do so? They remain philosophical extensions of the idea rather than experimentally demonstrated conclusions. But even so, transmission theory itself, or variations of it, continue to attract attention because it attempts to address one of the deepest puzzles in science. Well, the classical transmission theory originated with thinkers like William James and Henri Bergson. Related questions continue to appear in modern discussions of consciousness. Many contemporary thinkers, including philosopher David Chalmers, cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman, and neuroscientist Christoph Koch, have explored the possibility that consciousness may be more fundamental than traditional brain based models once assumed. What all of these perspectives share is not a single answer, but a shift in the question itself. We began with a common assumption most carry that the brain produces consciousness. And to be fair, that model explains a tremendous amount of what neuroscience observes. Changes to the brain can change perception, memory, personality, and awareness. But the closer we looked, the relationship between brain and consciousness becomes a little more nuanced than that simple picture suggests. Based on all of this, I am so curious what you think. So please let me know in the comments below. Do you think the brain is actually producing consciousness the way a generator produces electricity? Or could it be functioning more like a filter, shaping a much larger field of awareness into the narrow stream of experience we call a mind? And if the brain is really filtering something, what is the source of it and where might it be coming from? Thank you so much for making it to the end. And if you enjoy exploring science at the edge and beyond, I hope you will join the community and subscribe. Until next time, stay curious and take care.